in that? Then anytime you want to start, we could. Yeah.
Okay. So everybody can see my slides? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Then I will begin. My topic today I've called Flourishing and Culture in Health Research, but we're going to build up to that. So first, I want to acknowledge that we are meeting on Treaty 6 territory. It's really important to acknowledge the histories and the legacies that the Indigenous people of these communities have contributed to our being here today. I also want to add a disclaimer that I don't have the answers. I am a microbiologist currently, but my minor in my undergrad was in women's studies. So I have a background in critical social theory, but I don't consider myself an expert. And I think that's good. I want this to be a discussion today. So if there's anything that doesn't make sense or you need clarification, anything that makes you mad, I want you to let me know and we can stop and discuss. So I have no real timeline for us today. We can kind of get where we're going together. So whatever you guys need. I thought I should give you a little bit of a background on Mr. Watts. So I'm hoping that most of you had a chance to watch that video. He is, or was, I guess, a philosopher. He was in Britain and he had, like, his philosophy was mainly combining Eastern philosophy and kind of explaining it for a Western audience. So he deals a lot with spirituality, Zen Buddhism, all of those kind of things. But he, like, I hope you found that video relatively easy to digest as a non-Eastern philosophy folk. And as you kind of can anticipate from the title of our lecture, I want to talk about human flourishing. So what is that? Wikipedia tells me that it refers to a state of being where people are living in this optimal range of human functioning. What does that mean? I think we could have a whole nother lecture on what that even means. But to save time, we're going to look at what the Harvard Institute for Human Flourishing suggests. So they say that there are 6 domains that you need to think about when you're considering whether or not someone is flourishing. So there's happiness, your physical and your mental health, your meaning, purpose, character, virtue, your close relationships, and your financial material stability. I would like to remind you that we are kind of involved in this medicine writ large conversation, right? We're thinking about how medicine can be practiced in a way that promotes health in its entirety, in all 6 of those domains, right? I think as healthcare interested people, it can be easy to really focus in on, like, that person has this disease and, the chemicals in their blood are out of whack and whatever. But I want to remind us that that's all happening in a broader context, and that addressing that broader context is just as important. And so I really want to talk about how we, as people who, whatever means, are interested and involved in health promotion and health research, how we can ensure that humans all across the globe have the opportunity to flourish. Keeping in mind that flourish really comes down to those weird domains, right? And so when we are asking this question, we have to actually figure out, well, what are our definitions, right? Like, what knowledge are we bringing into this discussion? what knowledge are we using in this discussion? How are we framing these problems? Because if we are framing them in such and such a way, we are going to come up with solutions that answer those questions. So asking our questions, very important. And so I want to introduce you to the concept of epistemology. This is going to be your $10 word for the day. And it describes the philosophical field of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Okay, so what is knowledge? How do we gain knowledge? Can we even have knowledge? Is that, like, does it exist? What kind of knowledge is there? And I would like to start by asking a question. When you think of science, and I'm specifically talking about like naturalistic science, how do we gain knowledge? Like, what kind of knowledge do we gain through science? What does it look like? Just anyone want to throw out some adjectives, or how would you describe science?
Quantifiable.
Yeah, quantifiable.
Doing experiments.
Yeah, experiments.
Observational.
Observational.
I guess.
Yeah. I would say it's all of those things. I'm purposely trying to avoid defining science precisely because I want us to kind of work with this looser definition, like we're all kind of familiar with what it means, but it's somewhere in this realm of, quantifiable, precise, falsifiable, physical, objective, evidence-based, value-free, rational. And that's great, right? Like we love science. It is such a big part of what we do in academia. But when we start to look at, okay, we want to figure out how to improve those domains of flourishing, which of these do you think we can actually test or fix with science? Or are there any that you think, like, which ones of these could we investigate with science? Does anybody have ideas?
Mental and physical health.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else?
Financial and material stability.
Yep. And anything else? I say not really. Those two are the only aspects that are really ready to be quantified, right? Like to actually do a test and understand in this very narrow field of science as this objective, great thing. And so what I'm hoping that video kind of got you thinking about was maybe this isn't a full enough picture. Maybe it's an oversimplification. Not only are we missing, like if we're only using science to think about what it means to flourish, we're really only able to look at these two domains, if you will. And then when we are looking at them through the lens of science, are we really getting the best answers possible? Our science is only as good as our science is. The whole endeavor of science is to improve, but that means that right now maybe we're not improved. A lot of science or healthcare are very formulaic answers. Can we really trust their universality in the context of human flourishing? I think everyone who's ever gone on a diet knows that it's not that easy to make a change to your physical health. It's not that easy to just be like, I'm going to eat 1 apple a day and 5 blueberries, and that's going to be it. And we also can't necessarily foresee all the consequences. I think this was a huge topic that Watts touched on, and it definitely strikes a chord with us because we want to believe that our science is good and useful, and it is. I'm not saying that it isn't, but we don't know what we don't know. And so what I would like for us to kind of talk about is we have this mode of knowing, we call it science, but what else is there and what do we do with that? So the alternative to, scientific epistemology, if you will, we might call it experiential knowledge or standpoint epistemology. This is a term used by feminists and critical theorists to describe knowledge that can only really be known from living it. Like you can only know, you can only know what it feels like to be depressed if you've had depression. Otherwise, you can't necessarily fully comprehend that experience, etc. But this knowledge is qualitative, right? It's feelings, it's opinions, it's imprecise, subjective, value-laden, it's seen as irrational, and it is not really what we use in the academy, right? We usually default to science, like hard science. And so I want to talk about what Watts calls conceit. And I hate to have to use this word because it makes me angry too. Like I hate thinking that my actions could be conceitful, or me as, a healthcare practitioner or whatever in the future, that I could be doing something like, it just feels like a yucky word. But I want to use it because I think that it's important for us to feel that defensiveness. We get these ideas and, we've done the peer review, we've done these great analyses, and we're protective of our ideas. We think that whatever sciencey thing that we're doing, it works in the lab, it's valid data, we get protective of it and we think, oh, this should function in the real world. This is a great idea. And so our ego gets involved and we kind of protect it. We say, no, this is the right way to do it. Why would we do it any other way? Science and the scientific method and being rational and, like we've seen how calories affect the body. So just count your calories and then you'll lose weight, right? Like that, these ideas of simple scientific solutions, we kind of resist these real other questions that we might ask if we were thinking experientially, what if things change? What if there's an unintended consequence? What might we be ignoring? And I don't mean to say that healthcare or, science are they're not completely separated at this time. But I think having this discussion about, okay, well, where is the line? What can we question? What can't we question, and why? And so I'd like to introduce you to this topic of epistemological hegemony or hegemony. I don't know how to pronounce it. If anybody does, please fix me. And it is this concept that discusses the domination of one view of knowledge and the subordination of all other forms. And so this is what I'm talking about, that when we put an over-reliance on science and rationality and all of these, epistemological methods, we kind of miss other stuff. we by placing this huge emphasis on the sciences, we kind of delegitimize the arts, experiences, and in a way it's domination, which again feels yucky because we don't want to think that way. Our science is tested and tried. Like we've looked at the papers, we've done the analyses, and it looks good, but by only looking at those numbers, we're failing to pay attention to other things. And so it kind of lends to this bigger conversation, which is something we can get into later if you really are interested in this topic. But in the feminist literature, at least, there is a lot of discussion about science playing a masculine role. And by that, I mean that, this like rationality and authority and, this position that science is given in Western society, this higher up position, is tied to different forms of, they call it masculine violence in the literature, which is also kind of a weird term, but this unequal playing field and this domination. And so maybe we could say these terms are loosely related and maybe science can be violent. Is that something we're comfortable with? No. We don't want to think about science being violent, but we kind of have to be willing to have that conversation, right? In order to ensure that it has the best chance at not being violent, we need to have conversations about why it might be violent. And here we're using the WHO's definition of violence, where they talk about, power and like psychological harm, those kind of things. Remember, when we're talking about like this kind of violence, we're not necessarily talking about like swords or guns. Like we're not talking about physical violence. Instead, we're talking about these power dynamics and what these power dynamics really have to say about an individual's humanity, because whoever is being subordinated, or whoever's ways of knowing are being subordinated, are not being taken as seriously as whomever's views are being are the dominant views. And so it's maybe this act of power, one or over another. Again, I feel a lot of things when it comes to talking about like naming it with this, but I think that it's productive, especially when we go back to Watts and we see him use the word rampage. He says that we white Anglo-Saxons have been on a rampage to improve the world. And I love this because it resonates. They use this quote, kindly let me help you or you'll drown, said the monkey, putting the fish safely up the tree. If we as Western academics acknowledge that we have this epistemological assumption, we're thinking in scientific terms and we're going abroad, we're interacting with people of diverse backgrounds within our own communities, and we think we're right, and we're helping, but we don't understand what the fish needs. And so I want to suggest that violence isn't necessarily malicious with this definition. You can have these power structures in place without necessarily a malicious reason for doing it. most of our data that we have in our literature, like the stuff that we reference and are using to make decisions and, inform intervention, it's really skewed. It's skewed towards people who are like us, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And that's not what the globe looks like. When we think about the vast diversity of human experience, that doesn't even begin to cut it. In many ways, we're outliers. And so, violence isn't necessarily always malevolent. I really love this quote. It's by another Buddhist philosopher. And he says, "To love without knowing how to love wounds the person that we love. To know how to love someone, we have to understand them. To understand, we need to listen." And I think this is lovely. I think that we can be well-intentioned. We may rush to help, wanting to help, without fully understanding how the problem is experienced firsthand. We are acting, as Watts would say, conceitfully, because we believe that our method is universal and that our understanding of the situation is sufficient to solve it. And it feels yucky to admit that we don't know. We want to be confident in our interventions, we want to be confident in our science, but when we do this, we risk missing a piece of the story. And so I will tell you, in my last class that I took for my women's studies minor, she got us to read this paper about the HPV vaccine in India. And they talked about this story about how it was like medicalized violence, and it was this like the way that they made it seem was like this horrific thing. And I was mad. This paper made me so mad because I was so defensive. I was like, no, vaccines are good. Like, we are helping people. We are, we're out there making them healthier, saving them from disease. This is good. And then I reread the paper again. And I started to understand what it meant by medicalized violence. This act of power, these power dynamics that can occur when we are, going abroad and, doing these things. We take science and, science is so great, and we don't understand what the people actually need. So the argument in this paper was that this action was an extension. It's similar to like missionary work, but instead of saving souls, they're saving bodies. And that because it was a vaccine targeted at women and it was largely untested, and it was, the age that they wanted to administer it was very young, whereas in like local culture, they're not being sexually active at that age. So it doesn't make sense for these children, adolescents, to be guinea pigs. When you start to finally understand like the nuances of why these people being like the people experiencing it, but also like the advocates, like why these people are upset. And it's taken me a long time to really understand, like challenge that assumption that I have, that science is good, that vaccines are good, and like that there should be no question about it. And I hope that maybe some of you are less stuck than I was. And this is, again, not to say that vaccines aren't good, but that taking them to de facto be good is problematic. Yeah, so here are kind of what I synthesize as Watts's two main challenges to this hegemonic scientific epistemology. Again, that's a big term, but what it means is like science being the best way to know things and not really being able to question it. And so, yeah, we talked about how science is kind of oversimplified. It's the world is so complex. And then we also talked about this conceit bit. We get these nice little descriptions from our papers and our trials, and it's great. And then we say, this is the answer. And like we're open to being questioned, but only open to being questioned by other data. Like if I say, oh, this is the best diet, and then someone else says, no, this is the best diet, then we can have, then it's okay to like have that dialogue. But when you're not speaking when you're bringing a different type of knowledge in, you're saying, oh, well, that diet sucks because, like an experiential thing of like, oh, well, that diet sucks because I can't get that diet. That diet's not available to me in my area. Those are very different questions. And one is kind of taken more seriously than the other when we're thinking about the validity of a diet, if we're researching this. And so I would like to suggest that there are kind of two philosophical foundations that we can kind of use to improve on this. The first is pessimistic induction. It is also referred to as pessimistic meta-induction. And according to Wikipedia, it says, if past successful and accepted scientific theories were found to be false, then we have no reason to believe that our scientific realist claims that our currently successful theories are approximately true. This is big philosophy talk for, if our science was wrong before, how do we know that our science isn't wrong now? And I think that the most effective answer to this question, I don't know if it's the right answer, but I think one of the most effective approaches is assuming that it's not. Not to say that we have to inherently accept that our research is flawed, but always maintaining that openness that we're wrong, that this could be disproven, this could be improved. Having this, like accepting this limitation for yourself and for your research and science in general opens up a whole new dialogue. And then this leads us to self-reflexivity. It is a topic that's talked a lot about in, again, like the social critical theory space. And what it really means is like taking account of oneself, looking at the ways that we as academics, as theorists, how do we impact what we're doing? What is our relationship to this? Why are we doing this research? Why, what is our motivation? Why are we choosing these methods? Being reflective of like, this is my epistemological approach. This is how I'm trying to make knowledge. Why? Why am I using this method? What is it going to do? Am I going to have success? So with the pessimistic meta-induction, we can be critical of our scientific theories. We ought to welcome a disapproval or expansion. And with the self-reflectivity, we can be critical of ourselves and recognize our own assumptions, our motivations, our attachment to certain solutions. Because remember, we have that kind of conceit bit. We want to hold on to things and not look for areas where it's wrong. And this leads me to the culture in health research. So I'll be focusing more on the culture and health research, but it's also kind of complemented by this values-based practice. So what are these? Culture in health research is a research approach that specifically includes culture. And they do this, we'll get into how they do this, but it's a very intentional and deliberate approach, and they really focus on those contextual factors. On the other hand, values-based practice is more like the hands-on, interacting with patients, as opposed to the research making, the knowledge making, that kind of practice on the culture side, the culture and health research side. And so I'll take you back to this epistemological hegemony, and I'll say this is a false dichotomy. We do not need to separate quantitative and qualitative knowledge. It feels like when we're thinking about this power dynamic of science being taken to be authoritative and rational, it doesn't have to be up there alone. Like we can start taking qualitative data more seriously. We can start integrating that into our analyses and into our health interventions. And so if we go back to these flourishing domains, we can see that a lot of, even our little yellow ones that are supposedly quantifiable, those are also impacted by the other aspects of that, those other domains. Your relationships will impact what you do on the weekends. Are you being active or are you staying at home? Your financial stability means that you can afford better food or not, or maybe you're under less stress because you have money, or all of these things are so interrelated. And when we try to say science science is how we're going to know, science is how we're going to fix this, we totally miss all of the other underlying things that are the reason, or that could be the reason driving someone to choose certain behaviors. And so some common techniques are ethnography. Anthropologists and different agents will go and live long-term or do, surveys, field work. They'll actually immerse themselves in the culture, whereas surveys are more at an arm's length. You ask questions, but you're still kind of further away. But there really is no single answer. So the book that I sent you guys a couple chapters of, it's a huge book and I printed all of it. The other chapters are all examples of culture and health research being done. And so one of the chapters I sent you was actually the conclusion of the whole book. And so they synthesize kind of what these techniques look like. And they're really diverse. People have multiple methods. They mention that a lot of these approaches embrace complex analyses, and they layer multiple techniques, epistemologies, disciplines. It's really infinite, the possibilities. And that is so exciting, right? We might have a tendency to be defensive. Remember, if we're saying that scientific epistemology, science is a way of knowing, is this dominating, prized thing. But if we can see this and see, wait, if we include other analyses, there's so much more to be done. It doesn't need to be a threat to include other analyses. It opens doors instead of closes doors, like we might think. And so I'm sorry that these slides are kind of text heavy, but I wanted to kind of, these are all from the conclusion chapter, but they are a couple examples of what this looked like in action. So this chapter, they worked on water infrastructure, and they found that, people who were getting sick and having diarrhea, even if they were told, no, there's a river like down the hill and it doesn't have the whatever is causing disease, you just have to walk farther. And they didn't want to because it was too much, it was too onerous, too disruptive, too much for them. And this was especially true because it was often the women who were tasked with getting the water for the day. So it was too much for them to have to go walk far distances when they had so much else to do at home. And so if we think about what this intervention, like if we see this community and they're having, all of these sicknesses because of this contaminated water source, what do we do? Do we keep telling them, oh, go down the way, go down the way, go down the way? No, like the most effective approach here is actually helping them understand, or helping sanitize the water that they want to access. That is the way that they want the problem to be solved. And that's not necessarily the most efficient way, which is frustrating, right? We want our scientific background makes us want the most efficient way. We want to be efficient. We want it to be easy, but maybe it's more worthwhile for that community to have a local access to clean water as opposed to having to walk farther. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes, okay. And then the same kind of analysis was used, or same kind of approach here. Like they were looking at smoking in this community, and this community had a specific spiritual paradigm. And so they found that to actually address smoking in the community, people know that smoking is bad for them in the community. People aren't proud of it necessarily, but they found to actually effectively, target change and help that community quit smoking, they had to bring in a more spiritually balanced approach. They needed psychological support, spiritual support, not just being told over and over again to stop smoking because it's bad for your lungs. And yeah, so this brings me back to I say we in the most general, messy sense, but we as maybe a Western, a weird society, we kind of think or might think that we are rational. I'm really interested in how we can help other people flourish. How are we going to do humanitarianism right? How can we make sure that other people are able to flourish? And when we're thinking about this question, I think it's really easy to fall into oh, well, we are very smart here. We're very rational here. They are illogical. They are stuck in their traditions. And first of all, that's not easy. It's not easy to just let go of your tradition. It's not easy to just throw that away and adopt something more or something else because it's logical. That doesn't practically work. Here they say, just because this belief or practice, it might be sensible to them or it works well enough, so they don't want to give it up. And what did I do? So yeah, we kind of think in these advanced societies, oh, we are so smart, but we're not. We also have these unhealthy things that we cling on to that are just as emotional and irrational and fall under this experiential realm that we take for granted. We get emotional about scientific things. If you get a diagnosis, it's going to be emotional. You have your own interpretations. We all have our little habits and rituals. So it's not just I think in understanding how to approach other communities with empathy, we can also start looking at how our communities are also kind of similar. Yes, so yeah, this goes back to an example where they actually did an intervention in Australia, and they found that regardless of what your doctor is telling you, people continue to have these ideas about illness. Some people that they studied, at least, thought maybe magic or contagion or whatever. Like, there are all these different folk understandings of health that we still need to, like, we can't assume that they're just not a part of the conversation. To help actually make effective intervention, we need to bring them into the conversation. So again, if that belief is functional, people are resistant to give it up. And so this is what they say about culture. This is part of their summary. They say that despite globalization, like, we are more connected than ever, there are still isolated communities. There are still, or isolated cultures, I guess. Like, these cultures are still unique and specific to these spatial, environmental, historical locations. And we really can't predict how fast culture will change. So if we're thinking about making these grand interventions and thinking about, well, we need everybody to stop smoking, so we're going to fix our culture. Like, that isn't an overnight process either. And so it is much more effective to figure out how we're going to deal with that. Like, how we know that XYZ person isn't going to give up things. It's going to be a slow process. Now we're ready to take on the challenge because we understand it. And then, yeah, like, culture is very opaque. We don't really know, like, it can be really difficult to understand why people do what they do in the context of culture, because, peer pressure, socialization, normalization, like, these are such difficult things to track, but they're important nonetheless. We find them, and it gets another piece to the puzzle, right? They may not always be perfect. Our science is not perfect, and our, qualitative aspects of our research might not be perfect either, but it can help us understand more. And yeah, like, they're, even within communities, these cultural processes and, trends, they all manifest uniquely. And so these one size fits all, these, like, broad assumptions just don't work. Yeah. But culture in health research is not easy. I think it is a wonderful endeavor. I think that as a whole, the academy is on its way to embracing this sort of thing, but it's really limited by the way that we currently do things. The way that research is funded right now doesn't necessarily put emphasis on this sort of work, or it doesn't provide the sort of funding that is needed or the sort of resources that are needed. People have time limits. It's much easier, much easier to play with a mouse in a lab and see if it gains weight or not. It is so much harder to go out into the community and really understand why things are happening. And that process is exhausting for a researcher to have to go out to all these different communities or whatever their aim is. It's a lot. And I would also add, so those were their points in the black, but I would also add with my point that there has to also be this process of trust and relationship building. When, like, you can't just want to study some culture and then, like, mosey on down to their bank and be like, okay, guys, like, how do we do it here? What is this like? I think truly working with communities and helping them flourish will involve time and patience and sustainable relationship building. And so this is the author of the Epistemological Hegemony paper, and he talks about the Decolonized Academy. So again, he is using like this language to talk about that power structure, that domination and subordination. And so he says that the Decolonized Academy is interdisciplinary, politically active, and it actually respects those first-person experiential knowledges. It values social justice and seeks to understand outside of this scientific realm. And yeah, this is kind of like a little summary of kind of where we went just now. So, you know, science is in this privileged position. We assign it a lot of authority, but in doing so, we oversimplify issues, and we kind of, the conceit thing still gets me. I still don't like saying it, but like we cling on to these things, and it becomes part of our ego. We don't really want to let go of science being the best. And to do the work that we want to do, which is helping, you know, a diverse group of people flourish, we need to be more critical of our science, of ourselves, and then work towards building this culture in health research approach. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think about that. You may have seen there was an editorial in the New York Times yesterday about this extremely emotional language that's being recommended, like no longer describing a patient as being impoverished, but rather saying they are oppressed. Now, they may not realize that. They may not consider themselves that way. So we're sort of getting ahead of what the person themselves feels, but maybe it's good. I just wondered what you thought about making those sorts of jumps.
Yeah. So I'll refer you back to the paper on violence. So the paper that I read was actually specifically about violence in medicine. And I'm kind of like you, like I resist. I feel icky calling it violence. I feel icky saying oppressed, but their reason for wanting to use that language is to validate experience, you know, like calling it, like, why the argument might be that we resist calling it violence because it makes us feel bad, right? Like we resist using that kind of language because we are trying to avoid acknowledging the problem. And so what the argument might be is that using this harsher language legitimizes that experience. So, you know, acknowledging, like using these words helps us kind of understand that there is a spectrum to it, but also like there is a spectrum. I'm speaking to violence, but like there's a spectrum of violence, and we, by including more things on that spectrum of like, oh, well, this is like whatever, we are allowing ourselves the opportunity to discuss those power relations.
Yeah.
So I think the same might be said for that, like just making the power dynamic explicit and clear with the intent of being more compassionate and reflective in those interactions, I think.
Yeah. But I could imagine the impoverished people themselves feeling that being poor is challenging enough. To consider yourself to be actually oppressed
Mhm.
is increasing the amount of challenge that
Yeah.
you have to kind of come up with new defenses against being oppressed. And maybe you yourself don't really think of your situation that way. The only
Yeah.
thing wrong is there's too little money, you know?
Yeah.
No
think-
other problem. Yeah.
Yeah. I think like the language there, again, like I'm not super familiar with this issue in particular, but I think the language there is meant to reflect that it is a broader structural problem, like a social problem,
Yeah.
as opposed to an individual problem. So like when we're saying someone is impoverished, it kind of, the undertone, like some might say that the undertone is that someone got themselves into that situation,
Yeah.
right? If they are impoverished, that's like getting there is a different process than being oppressed. And whereas like the oppression would acknowledge that there are like structural issues that wound that person up in that situation.
Right.
But I don't think it's like a simple, yeah.
So Sean and Samadhi, yeah.
Do you think culture is something that can be classified? When you think of culture, what do you think of it? What is culture as an entity?
Oh my goodness. So it's very complicated. So for this book that I'm kind of relying a lot on, I read the introduction, a few chapters in the middle, and then the conclusion. And from what I've gathered from them, it's very ethereal. Like it's so hard to pin down what culture is. I think like they talk about it as, you know, a mode of being, as like a community, like it's really difficult to pin down. I think when we are talking about these, like designing different research studies, you know, designing different interventions, I think it would be optimal to define culture for the context that we're trying to use it, right? So if we're trying to do a study and we want to understand how this, you know, local population will perceive this medication, we need to ask them what culture means to them and try to parse out which elements of that will affect whatever we're trying to do. But it's very difficult. You know, they talk a lot in the study or in the book about like, how do we, like, it's not really something, like we want to quantify it, right? But is that science brain? like is our urge to quantify culture and have it in nice little neat boxes, that might be science brain talking. And we're trying to bring, you know, experiential brain into this, if you will. Do you kind of get what I'm going for there?
Yeah, it was kind of a loaded question because I'm a cultural studies major.
Okay,
Your response was good. I liked your response. A useful metaphor that's used in cultural studies when thinking about culture is culture is like a fractal. When you zoom in on the boundaries, expecting to see, okay, clearly here's one color separated from another color, you don't get that nice delineation. It just repeats over and over and over again. So the boundaries just don't exist. And it's a huge challenge within our field to determine, okay, what view of culture are we going to use in this analysis?
Yeah.
It gets even harder when the communities themselves don't even know how to define themselves. A big problem we get in our qualitative research is the amount of I don't knows that come about when you conduct this kind of qualitative research.
Yeah. If you could unshare your slides, then we'd see people bigger. That might be more fun to interact. There we go. Okay. Now we got big people. Okay, Samadhi.
Hello. I'm really first of all, I love this discussion. Thank you for having a great talk, because like I myself, I was also raised in a Buddhist background, so I have like a lot of this Eastern mumbo jumbo going on in my brain. And when I moved here, I felt like I actually was met with these kind of questions very early on. I came here when I was 11, and immediately I was like, oh, I thought it was this way, but I guess not. Like, a lot of Buddhist values have a very holistic view on medicine. So like, it's like, if you are going through some ailments, you're probably having some mental like issues that you need to sort out, and then maybe like some environmental issues. But then when I came here, like, you go to the doctor's office and they don't talk about that. They instead talk about, oh, so you have something wrong with your knee. We need to go to a knee specialist, you know, and this knee specialist will like talk about this and that. And it was interesting to see. I had to like adapt really when it came to that. And yeah, I was really unable to explain a lot of my ideas because of like this, like if I was like, oh, but maybe that was a bad example, but maybe my knee is hurt because of, I don't know, I have a bad chair. There's no like there's no science talk for it. And then the doctor will be like, oh, but the evidence shows this. And I'm like, oh, but I wasn't raised to think this way. I don't know, bad example. But yeah, that's what I wanted to bring up. And also, I think the discussion there was before about, what was it? We were talking about labeling people as being oppressed rather than what was the other word, impoverished. Right? Yeah, it's really interesting because I also delved into this a little bit, and there are interesting talks about First Nations people, right? They're uncomfortable with the name, like, what is it? No, in America, First Nations people, they're called Indians sometimes, right? But then now people are trying to correct themselves and be like, oh, we should actually consider them as Aboriginals or like First Nations and things like that. But when you actually go and talk to these communities, they're like, no, actually, I'd rather be called Indian because I've been told to conform to this. This is now my culture, right? So same with African Americans, right? A lot of different communities have that like I want to be considered African American, I want to be considered Black. Like they have all these different languages. Mm-hmm. So like maybe a solution is like, it's difficult, but like to ask them and be like, hey, what do you prefer to be called? And then at that point, you've cleared it up because it is more complex, but at the same time, we are human and irrational, so we're bound to be complex. So yeah, sorry, I talk a lot. Thank you. Those are my thoughts. Yeah, I love your talk. Oh.
I'm glad that I'm still new to like Eastern philosophy, so I'm glad that I sort of am doing it justice.
Yay, good job. I'm very proud.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? Like it really has forced me to challenge a lot of my core assumptions. And I think to kind of get to your point of like, labels do matter, right? They feel really trivial, or they like to the science brain, as I'm calling it, like it feels so trivial. Like, oh, why does it matter what we call things? Why does it matter what we do? And it's like, no, like we're missing, when we're making assumptions like that, we're really missing that experience part of it. Those words have loaded meanings, and especially for those like the people who the words are being used against or whatever, like it means a lot to them. And I think when we're talking about, because I think, okay, my impression of the Watts video is that he's kind of anti-science, right? Like he kind of comes across a little like, why are we doing this? What is the point? Blah, blah, blah. Oh, and someone like brought up, like, he says history repeats itself. What do we mean by that? And I think like the one thing that I really take away from that video is that we always think we're right. we get excited and we think we found the thing. We found the magic wand, and we're gonna go fix everything, and we're gonna kill it. We're gonna crush it. It's gonna be great. And that's not the case. And I think there is no perfect way forward. but being mindful of the fact that we are probably making mistakes as we're going
Mhm.
along makes it a lot easier to solve those mistakes. Like if we're in denial about there being a problem, we're never going to get to it. If we're just putting everything to the side.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Let me hear from you, Kashika.
So I love the spirit of conversation that everyone is having here.
Mhm.
But my question is that so basically I'm going to use the example of my mother. So when she has something wrong with her body, she does not feel well. She doesn't straight away go to the doctor's office. She believes that she could cure that by herself. She believes that she could use medicines that are available at home. So, and you talked about this trust relationship with people in medicine, and and when you talked about the HPV vaccines in India, and those kind of scenarios make people lose trust and relationship with medicine. And so here, for my mother, she doesn't exactly believe that she has to go to the doctor's office and get this checked. She believes that she could do this by herself.
Mhm.
But then, how do you? So basically, when technology increases, then technology and medicine increases. That means more power, and it depends on people how they use that power. So, how do you think will that this trust relationship between the patient and the medicine, the people, the doctors, will be in the future? Do you think people will decline that and then go on their own about taking on what can we do to themselves, or do you think they would definitely go to the doctor's office and then they will trust people there?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think you're definitely hitting at a key point here, right? Like part of why I feel compelled to talk about topics like this are because I think we need to start thinking about how we're going to develop trust. How not only developing trust, but a genuine sort of compassion for the people we're helping. You know, if your mom goes to the doctor and she feels like the doctor is really hearing her concerns and really understands, you know, whatever's wrong with her, if the doctor really is taking the time to understand and help her understand all the other stuff that's going on, she might feel safer to actually participate in that interaction, right? If we are taking emotion out of it, if we're saying we're just being rational, then it's scary. It's scary to go to the doctor. It's scary to be vulnerable in those spaces when it's just this, you know, science and technology. Like it feels daunting. And so I think integrating the humanities, finding ways to integrate like values into practice is what is going to be needed to actually be effective. Yes, Kim?
Yeah, we have students in the room here.
Hello.
Hello.
So I wanted to go back to the concept of both oppression and holistic medicine.
Mhm.
So first, I want to ask, like, is oppression considered a form of violence? Can we
Yes.
define oppression as violence? Yeah.
I would say, I don't want, okay, the Taryn method is to never really give
A
a
proper
full
definition.
like I don't want to, because I am not an expert here, but I would say that they're very related.
Okay.
I'm not sure where I draw the line though.
So in that, following that concept, when we're talking about this holistic medicine view, I find that a lot of, you know, Eastern and South Asian types of remedies are holistic in the sense of the medication is holistic. So it'll be like, oh, you need, like, we think you're sick in this way. We're going to grind this plant and this plant and give you all of them. In Western society, usually what they do is they'll find out what's actually the quote unquote active compound. They'll isolate that, make it in labs, and they'll just give you pills of just that super concentrated. And the thing is, what I've learned from one of my friends who's in dietetics, I asked her, okay, so my younger sibling is lactose intolerant and they're just starting like high school, like they're pretty young, like, do you think that's going to affect their bone growth? And she said, the thing is, when you take these nutrients or whatever out of their naturally occurring environment, like out of the plant, and you just have like vitamin D by itself, that's not integrated into your body in the same way that it would be if it was with the other things that are coming with the milk, let's say, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of holistic view is very prominent in the Eastern medications. But then also in the same sense, along the same line, Western medicine, if there's something in Eastern medicine that they just do it, they don't know how things work, let's say. They don't investigate, like, what is the pathway or what is the, the organs or the receptors that these medications are working on. We just know that if you're feeling like this, if you're sick in this way, if we give you this as your treatment, it will probably work. Mm-hmm. On the Western side, they'll look at that, and if they don't understand why that works, they'll not feel like it's useful, or they'll devaluate that kind of medication because they're like, mm-hmm. Oh, you don't know why it works. So how do you actually know it works at all? Mm-hmm. And then, years go by, and then later they're like, oh, we found this thing in there and we know how it works now. So yippee-ki-yay, like, look at this cool new medication. But actually everybody was already using that. But mm-hmm. in the past, when you didn't understand exactly how it worked, you were in a sense oppressing them with your hegemony of, we know how our medications work. We know the exact pathways. We know their effectiveness. Whereas mm-hmm. you don't actually know any of that. So your medications aren't as valid.
Yeah.
And all that stuff.
Yes.
So yeah, just connecting back to everything Samadhi was talking about, and the holistic versus like the idealistic and the experimental.
Yeah, I think it really, like what you're saying, really taps into that like conceit thing that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Like we think that we need to have, and I don't know what the right answer is. Like I think that we could say that one of the reasons why we do certain things, in science is because like we want to make sure that there's no bad side effects, right? Like that's why we want to isolate the pathway. That's why we want to do this, et cetera, et cetera. But it's that conceit thing. Like we assume that it's capable to fully understand what's happening. We assume that we have this technology that can help us understand the exact pathway and we can get it down. And like, once we get that answer, then we're proud of it. Like we're gonna use it everywhere. It's great. But like you're saying, like it misses that nuance. We don't, I think it's difficult to say with like medicinal plants and stuff. It's something that is really, really challenges me, like where that line of like safety versus experimentation, like where it should be drawn. If we're giving someone the whole plant or an extract of the plant or whatever, and like I think it is really dependent on whatever plant we're talking about. But I think in trying to answer these questions, we might want to ask, like, well, why is someone wanting to take this extract? Like with your with the sibling with the lactose intolerance, like they want to take vitamin D because they cannot get it from milk, right? And so if we're taking it away, we're obviously making it less effective, even if like it's not benefiting that person, right? Maybe if there was a specific benefit to the person that's actually provable, or like the person themselves identifies a benefit, like maybe for like spiritual reasons, they feel that it's better to consume the whole plant, like if that was the way that they felt most comfortable and most most comfortable and most optimistic about healing, like that's a completely valid option to pursue, right? It's not just yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm rambling, but like, I really do like your comments. I think that there is this tendency of science to see, like, to find things that are done in Eastern medicine, try to change them, like scientify them, and then like claim them as our own. And I think that's really dangerous because it, you know, neglects the legacies and the histories and all of these aspects that contribute, you know, like you can't just isolate this plant and say like, oh, it never had a role in this community. We can't just bring it into like our Western society and be like, okay, we're going to extract this and that. Like, it would be naive to think that it would work the same way. Does that make sense?
So I think that in a kind of amusing way, you can look at Zoom communications as a kind of metaphor for evidence-based medical practice, right? You hear the phrase evidence-based so often, but in the old days when people actually went to the library and signed out books and stuff, already the evidence-based medicine books were covered with dust because nobody was looking at it. And if you think about the actual practice of medicine, a lot of it is like a Zoom call. Like, we don't have evidence-based of how close to get to the screen and whether to have our video on or not, and all sorts of things, whether you use the chat or what, you know, when to raise hand and so on. They're all this stuff is sort of experiential, and we're doing it the way we're doing it because it worked before. It's like catching a ball in the outfield. You know, you're not calculating formulas as to put your hands up. You're putting your hands up that way because it worked the previous times that you caught a ball that way. A lot of medicine is actually like that. So I think maybe the easiest thing to take away from that is just the idea that tacit knowledge is as respectable as evidence-based. And for a lot of the things you do, there can't possibly be evidence-based. Who's going to do a bunch of fake Zoom calls just to see what works best? Nobody, right? Certain kinds of experiments no one wants to do, no one is willing to do. So we ended up just sort of flying by the seat of our pants, you know, and yeah. So
yeah, I think you're right. And I'm not trying to paint science as completely separate. Like, I think a lot of physicians are really good at understanding where someone's coming from and helping them identify those like broader factors in their healthcare treatment. But I think it's always good to be mindful of the limitations and like have the discussion about like, how can we keep doing this better? How can we keep being critical of the knowledge we're producing, of the reason we're doing things, all of, you know, like, how can we make sure that we're continuing to reflect?
And many patients that you meet, the most, you know, emotionally engaging part of the healthcare experience for them has nothing to do with health and everything to do with racial bias and just this feeling of being other, feeling of being undervalued, that, you know, the actual contact time for people like you is less, and there's more time with the nurse, less time with the doctor, in a lot of quantifiable ways. And you find that always happens, right? And that there's a kind of, you know, mechanical simplicity of the conversations that the healthcare staff has with you, whereas you listen, and when they talk to other people, it's a normal, nuanced conversation with empathy and stuff that you just never get, you know? And so that can so color the healthcare encounter that it becomes more important than really anything else. And it becomes the reason that you're sick almost all the time. the reason that you're sick has something to do with this too.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I had a question actually for Dr. Solis.
Yeah.
So when you read that paper, you said they said to use oppressed instead of impoverished. Is that something you say to your patient directly, like you're calling them, like, you're you're oppressed?
So this is a New York Times editorial from yesterday. And yeah, as I understand it, they are advocating that you would use the term with the patient, even if the patient has never thought of themselves in that way until that moment. But you're telling them, you're not just short of money, the society is doing evil things to you, and that's the reason you have these problems, right?
Okay, then to follow up on that, I think like it brings a lot to be acknowledged when you use that terminology like that. But then also if they're advocating to use this kind of terminology, then it should also be used with a sense of having an offering of what the patient can do about it or how it could be addressed.
Can help.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because if you're just saying, you're not just impoverished, you're an oppressed party, and then they're like, okay, so like,
but I have no solution.
Yeah.
Right.
So now I'm even more out of control.
Yeah. But I think that if you go back, first of all, I don't know how many of you are 27 or soon will be or recently were 27, but Rudolf Virchow was 27 when he wrote all those famous quotes, the physician is a natural attorney of the poor and all that stuff, and about medicine writ large, and politics is really just medicine writ large. So he was like your age when he was having these thoughts. But yeah, well, I mean, that's really what the whole course is sort of about. I'm trying to teach you guys this larger concept that a lot of people think these things fall in the realm of social work or they're something outside of health, almost. The fact that the patient is maybe unemployed and, relatively homeless and really can't afford any of the meds that you're telling them that they need, it's sort of not a medical problem. It is a medical problem. Just like Virchow said. Yeah, so anyway, that's what I'm trying to teach you in this course, so that broader sphere of things.
I think Sean has a comment.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
just to jump in on the previous discussion. And the only thing that I view problematic with the idea of using this terminology of being oppressed is it begs the question of who is the oppressor. And unless that idea is very clear in your head and you can convey that very clearly, it could have some questionable results.
Yeah.
Yeah, what the editorial says is that it's completely impractical, and that just to convey medical care sort of gets in the way. I'm not sure that that's true, but that's what they're saying. That although all these left-leaning advocates are saying you should talk this way, medical personnel are not going to actually do this, because it feels like you're stumbling against something that wasn't there to stumble against before. And you were just, this patient has a problem, you think that you can help them, and you're trying to help them and telling them that they're oppressed and everything. What do you mean? It really doesn't help. Anyway, that's what the editorial says.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a really difficult, like I don't like the universality of it. Like I think that the conversation could be useful for to help someone understand their problem, like when we're thinking about, all of us are university educated, or I guess not all of us, some of us are 14, but most of us, we have an understanding of how these systems work. And I think part of the intent of bringing that dialogue into the physician's office is because maybe they're not having that dialogue elsewhere. You know, like maybe they don't understand medicine writ large, you know, like maybe it's, again, I would never like sit down with a patient and be like, you are oppressed, like this is what you need to do, blah, blah, blah. But I think if you have someone coming to you and saying, look, I can't afford food, I can't be like, I'm overweight, but it's only because I can only afford processed foods, blah, blah, blah. I think having like equipping physicians to have that conversation about, you know, systemic inequality could help the individual feel less to blame for themselves. I think that would be the logic, you know, like if someone's coming and they're upset and they don't understand, you know, like critical theory, this might be the way that some people would help alleviate that pressure. Because I think you're right, like you're oppressed, it sucks, like that's a garbage conversation, quite frankly. But I think if someone is presenting to you and they don't understand how these systems work, and like they don't understand how, you know, different social structure, like I think what Sean was saying, like who is the oppressor, most of those conversations I feel like would end up talking about like the system, like just acknowledging that the system is broken, and you know, me as your physician, I'm doing my best, but the reality is the system's broken. You have been dealt, like you, whoever this patient is, like you've been dealt a tough tough hand of cards. Here's what we're going to try to do about it, but it's not your fault. Or like, here, you know, here's where your agency in the situation lies.
Right. Let me just bring up the Simon Sinek point of view.
Mhm.
You probably know him. He's you know, professional keynote speaker who holds very low opinion of, you know, millennials and young people. And part of that would be, for instance, his opinion about what we're talking about now, just using sort of our own society, not thinking of any other parts of the world, just like the US and Canada, that in his way of thinking, most young people are completely spoiled, still living at home, no parental push for them to ever leave home. Therefore, how much money they make doesn't matter, right? Their lives are completely subsidized, and they feel entitled, and their parents reinforce this sense of entitlement, and they get all these awards when they haven't really done anything and stuff. So in that kind of world, it's ridiculous to call an impoverished person oppressed, because they're simply spoiled living at home with no push to ever leave home, right? So that Simon Sinek is wrong, but the thing is that he's an appealing guy. Your you know, endorphin flow goes up when you watch his videos and so on. And you know, if you read the Wikipedia stuff on him, I mean, there are a lot of formal criticisms of how his arguments are actually flawed and so on. But it's a good understanding to have, because you will meet people locally, like in Canada and here in Edmonton, who hold those same beliefs, that knowing nothing about you except that you're a young person, they immediately assume that you're living at home and no plans to ever become independent from your parents. And you know, your parents heap all sorts of you know, valuable things on you for no good reason. You don't have any idea how the world really works for most people and so on. Yeah. So it's important for you to know, as flawed as that view of the world is, that it's a fairly common view. And luckily, so Simon Sinek has been republishing old videos. And the good news is the number of views now is like a lot lower than it was 5 to 8 years ago. So he has less of an audience now, but he still has a significant audience.
Mhm. I have a few responses to that. I think, like, I mean, if we're going back, I like using Watts's argument that history repeats itself. You know, we have seen how in the past we have passed the buck on, you know, oh, we're not the problem. It's the younger generation's problem. They started this. And it's like, but you raised us. Like if you have criticism of my generation, you're criticizing the people who taught me how to be. Like you're criticizing the people who made me to be like I am,
Right.
which is your own. Like I think it's a form of scapegoating, and I think it, you know, is just a way to kind of avoid taking responsibility for some of the messes that have been left behind. Meaning like, you know, the environmental crisis, the energy sector being kind of bad, not kind of, being bad. You know, like all of these, the economy being so fragile. Like it's easy to be like, it's the millennials, like they're in the workforce now, they're the ones messing it up. Okay, or you handed us a you know, a time bomb and we're just doing the best we can with it. But I recognize having that specific discussion with someone like that, not productive. You're not going to change his mind.
No.
What I would say to him though is that hate and, you know, like it has no place in healthcare. Being like, even if we assume that millennials are lazy, okay, they're lazy. What do we do now? I don't think that anger or hate or, you know, any of these sentiments are effective at enacting change. You're not, this is from so I took a course a few years ago that was all focused on like the health at every size movement. And one of their things that really stuck with me was that you're not going to hate yourself into being skinny. You know, people who are overweight experience a lot of stigma and backlash and hate. And that's never gonna, like no one wakes up and looks in the mirror, says, I hate myself, and then like wants to go be healthy about it. And so that's what I would say to him, like, okay, sure, millennials are lazy, but if we actually want to have a productive conversation and, you know, make change, harping on that fact over and over again and just being belligerent doesn't allow for any progress or conversation. It just distracts us from the actual conversation that needs to be had.
Right. And the nice thing about health, you can take parts of the world where the, you know, divisions between groups are so many centuries old and unfixable and so on. And still, from the pure health point of view, you can go in there, find a health problem, fix it, you know, do good things for people, make them better, even though the underlying problems are so unfixable. Like I went to Kosovo right after the NATO bombing, and like that was exactly what we faced there. You know, there like these enormous prejudices. The hallways had these strange odors where you imagined some of the, you know, disappeared people were actually in the walls and that sort of thing. And I I don't know to what extent that was true, but I'm sure it was partially true. So, but you could still, that's a wonderful thing about careers in health. You could still find valuable things to do there where you knew what to do. You actually help people. You improve the situation, even though the background of what these people have to face every day in terms of hatred and bias is just crazy. So and the same is true, like prejudice against young people is probably not justified, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it still shouldn't be a part of how you treat somebody when they're your patient. And it's a little bit, I mean, in the extreme, it's a little bit like what lawyers do, right? Lawyers defend clients who are actually guilty. It's not that they just help the innocent, right? They also help guilty people, right? So to some extent, your average patient is a sort of flawed human, just like the rest of us, right? You're not expecting them to be perfect. You're still able to help them, right? They don't have to sort of prove that they're perfect first and then they get help. That isn't how things work.
Yeah. I think I'm hopeful that, I guess I was never explicit about it in my talk, but like, I hope that everybody picked up on the underlying theme of autonomy, like that we as in, I don't know, healthcare providers who are interested in, good healthcare. I don't know, that might sound mean, but like, to me, it's important that, we don't just, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, we like treat the whole problem. We don't just, relegate it to certain things, and that we really frame these questions as like questions of autonomy, like what is best for this person according to this person. And they might be oppressed, and we can talk about how these structures affect them. They might be doing the oppressing, or they might be a bad person in some way, but we are here to help people live their best life for themselves.
Right.
And I think that life should include not harming other people. Like, I don't think that we should, I don't know, but like, we shouldn't support people when they tell us they want to do bad things, but for them to live a fulfilling and flourishing life, we want what's best for them because it's for them.
Yeah. And I think another simple way to think about it is when you think about specialties of medicine, are plastic surgeons evil and wrong? No, they aren't evil and wrong. No, it's not that that's a morally depraved area of medicine. I mean, there are lots of people with sort of legitimate need for plastic surgery help, but also you're not there to judge that, and it's going to be more and more the case that a lot of medical care contacts are people wanting enhancement, right? Not necessarily physical, it could be moral, spiritual, but that will be the main thing that they want. They're not sick. They just think you as a physician hold the means for them improving themselves in the way that they want to be improved.
Yeah, I definitely think it lends to a lot of conversations about like, well, why do you want these improvements? Like,
right.
As a physician, you're concerned about their overall health. And so keeping in mind, like, okay, maybe someone wants plastic surgery because they're struggling with body issues and, that kind of stuff. And I don't think struggling with body issues or, you know, like some of these like values, whatever, like struggling with those things don't necessarily rule out plastic surgery. I don't think, you know, oh, you have body dysmorphia, so you should never be able to have plastic surgery. But I think recognizing that there is this like broader social context that we're treating people in helps us have a more meaningful conversation with them. You know, I will give you plastic surgery, but would you also consider looking into mental health support, or, you know, like identifying these broader issues at the same time, but doing it with the patient's own like best interest in mind,
Sure.
which is a lot easier said than done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's 3:36. So anyway, this has been a great session. Taryn, thank you very much. And Kashika, thank you for joining us in the middle of the night in India. Yeah, so anyway, we have another session with Ishita Mogi on Thursday, so that should be equally interesting. To be honest, I don't know exactly what we're doing on the 30th, but I'm eager to find out as soon as I can, just as you are. So anyway, but you understand there's a sequence where I want to wait until Shauna grades the midterm exams before pressuring her to kind of define what we're doing on the 30th. So yeah, that's how that is going. Okay, so thanks everybody for today. Thank you, Taryn, very much. And any other comments, closing comments? Okay. We'll see you on Thursday, guys. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.